I had just finished signing the paperwork for the land when a stranger walked up and told me I owed them $22,000 in HOA fees. 48 hours. Just 48 hours after my name was entered into the county records. The wind swept along the hillside, carrying the smell of dry grass and red soil. In front of me stretched 180 acres of empty land in northern Tennessee, a space so wide that the sound of birds felt like it was echoing from another world. I had not even set boundary stakes yet, had not pitched a temporary tent, had not left a single footprint long enough to call it mine, and yet she walked straight toward me, sharp heels sinking into soft earth, each step landing like a challenge. She shoved a thick binder straight into my chest, the sharp sweetness of her perfume overpowering the smell of weeds. Her voice was crisp and cold. "You are the new landowner, right? Congratulations. But you owe our homeowners association $22,000 in back dues and violations." I looked around. No fences, no entrance gate, no paved road, just wind, grass, and a few of the neighbors' cattle standing in the distance, heads lifted as if even they were wondering what had just happened. In that moment, everything went silent. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow but heavy, like metal striking metal. I asked, carefully, "Which HOA?" She smiled, the kind of smile worn by someone used to watching others back down. "I am Madeline Price, president of the Cedar Bluff Estates Homeowners Association." She said the name as if she were introducing an empire. She pointed east toward a white mansion perched on the hillside, its lawn trimmed so tight it looked artificial. "We have 14 upscale households. We bring standards to this area." Standards. I swallowed hard. Standards for empty land that had existed long before she was born. I pulled the deed from my jacket pocket. Thin paper, slightly wrinkled from being read all night long. "This is agricultural land," I said. "There is no HOA here." Her eyes flicked over the paper, then settled back on my face. The smile never left. "The previous owner signed an agreement. You inherit all obligations. $22,000 in back dues, $900 a month going forward." A short, cold thought flashed through my mind. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated strike. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because if I did not, the anger boiling inside me would spill over. "HOA fees on empty land," I repeated. She tilted her head, her voice dropping into something darker. "If you do not cooperate, we will file a lien. Notify the county. Destroy your credit. Make this very difficult for you." She flipped through a few pages in the binder and handed me printed emails. The paper still smelled of fresh ink. The font was strange. The timestamps did not line up. A scanned signature, warped and uneven. I looked at them, then handed them back. "I need documents that are officially recorded with the county." She pulled her hand back a fraction too fast. "Look them up yourself." Then she turned and walked away, her heels stabbing into the dirt, leaving small dents sharp as threats. I stood there long after she disappeared. The wind picked up again. The cattle lowered their heads and went back to grazing, as if nothing had happened. I thought about how I had just bought 180 acres for $3,500 at a tax auction everyone said was too good to be true. I thought about 15 years repairing agricultural machinery, my back bent under the weight of steel, my hands always slick with oil. I thought about why I was here, not to start a fight, not to play power games. But then, another feeling crept in. Cold and unmistakably clear. If they dared to do this to me, how many others had they done it to? This was not just another HOA Karen story. This was a scam practiced until it felt routine. And in that moment, while Madeline Price assumed I was just a small-town mechanic who lucked into cheap land, she missed one thing. I had what she could not see: time, patience, and real power. The kind that lives in recorded documents, not in a glossy binder. I got the call telling me my uncle had passed away while I was lying under a tractor, my hands covered in oil and dirt. The first sound I heard after that was not crying, but the sharp crack of hot metal as the engine shut down abruptly. My uncle did not leave behind much. No big house, no stocks, no long, complicated will. He left me just enough money for someone else to buy a new truck. But for me, it opened a way out. $60,000. Not a large amount in the city, but for someone who had spent 15 years bent under steel like I had, it felt like breathing again. I had been repairing agricultural machinery and heavy trucks since I was not yet 25. At first, it was a choice. Then it became inertia. Day after day, the smell of diesel, the scent of hot metal, the sound of hammers striking bolts. My body learned how to endure, and my mind learned how to slowly shut down its dreams. At some point, I realized I could no longer tell the difference between the smell of WD-40 and the sweat soaked into my own shirt. I was living well, but I was not living right. My uncle used to say something I never forgot. Land will not betray you if you are willing to listen to it. He was the last person in my family who still spoke to fields and soil like they were kin. When he died, the old house was left empty. But that sentence never left me. A few weeks after the funeral, I sat alone in front of an old computer screen, scrolling through the state's tax auction listings. Just a habit, just looking. Then I saw it. 180 acres. Northern Tennessee. Agricultural classification. Back taxes. Starting price, $3,500. The photos were blurry. The description was short. But something pulled me in. On Saturday morning, I drove out to see the land. I rolled the windows down and the wind rushed in, carrying the smell of wild plants and creek water. The dirt road crunched beneath the tires. I shut off the engine and stood there for a long time. The land opened up in front of me, so wide it made a man feel small. Low hills, a dry creek bed, old, rotting fence posts, leaning like tired witnesses to generations past. I bent down and scooped up a handful of soil. Dark, loose, cool. The kind of soil a farmer only has to touch to know it can sustain life. I realized I was smiling. For the first time in years, the auction took place on Monday morning. I sat in my truck, hands on the steering wheel, listening to the steady voice over the speaker. There was one other bidder. They raised the price slightly, then stopped. I waited. 10 minutes passed like 10 years. Then the gavel struck. Sold. I won. $3,500. 180 acres. The first feeling was not excitement. It was suspicion. Too cheap. Too easy. Like a door left wide open with no one guarding it. But I had read the law. I had checked the process. Everything was legitimate. I told myself that maybe luck had finally remembered me. On the fourth day after buying the land, I went back, bringing a notebook and a few basic measuring tools. I wanted to sketch out the boundaries, to start thinking about what to plant and how to run water. And then I saw it. To the east, on a hillside not far from my property, a white mansion stood clearly in the midday sun. A perfectly green lawn. A circular driveway, freshly painted wooden fences. It sat there like something out of place, disconnected from the land around it. Through the large windows, I saw a man in a polo shirt sitting at a computer, his back straight, his face focused. I do not know why, but in that moment, a warning crept in. Subtle, but unmistakable. I was taking notes on the slope of the land when I heard a sound that did not belong there. The click of high heels. Even. Hard. Each step striking in time with my heartbeat. I turned. A woman was walking toward me. Blonde hair. Light-colored dress. A binder in her hand. Her eyes were not searching. They were confirming. As if she had already decided who I was before we ever met. A bitter thought crossed my mind. Maybe I finally understood why this land had been so cheap. Not because the soil was bad, but because someone had tried to turn it into something no one dared touch. When she stopped in front of me and introduced herself as the HOA president, I saw clearly how she looked at me. A man with dusty clothes, calloused hands, standing alone on empty land. Easy to underestimate. Easy to threaten, easy to box in. She did not know that I was not here to ask permission from anyone. I was here to start over. And I had no intention of leaving because of a hastily printed binder. In that moment, between the wind and the soil, I understood that my life had just taken a different turn. Not the peaceful one I had imagined, but a path where I would have to relearn an old lesson. If you want to keep your land, you have to stand your ground first. She said the number $22,000, the way someone reads an overdue utility bill. I heard it like metal hitting the floor, cold and heavy. Madeline Price stood across from me, back straight, chin slightly raised, eyes unblinking. The binder lay open between us like a shield. Inside were thick printed pages, colored tabs, red underlines. She did not ask if I understood. She spoke, then waited for me to nod. The habit of someone used to winning. You are inheriting obligations from the previous owner, she said. Her voice was even. Not loud, not soft, precise, like a recording. Back dues, violation fees, special assessments. All of it adds up to $22,000. Starting next month, $900 per month. I looked at the binder, then at her, then at the empty land stretching out behind her. The wind picked up, tugging at the hem of her skirt. I asked a very simple question. Where exactly is your HOA located? She smiled. This time, it was a practiced smile. Cedar Bluff Estates. We have 14 upscale households. We protect community values. You are new here, so you may not be familiar. Not familiar. I swallowed. I was familiar with engines dying in the middle of harvest. Familiar with rusted bolts that refused to move. Familiar with being judged by hands covered in cuts and grease. But I had never been familiar with someone standing on my land and telling me I did not belong. I pulled out the deed. It was soft and plain. No decoration. Just words and a seal. This is agricultural land, I said. There is no recorded HOA. Madeline glanced at the paper as if it were worthless. The previous owner signed an agreement. She flipped to another page and handed me printed emails. A signature at the bottom. See, you inherit all obligations. I picked one up. The paper still smelled of fresh ink. The timestamp showed evening, but the font looked newly printed. The signature was warped, like someone practicing with their non-dominant hand. A familiar feeling ran up my spine. The feeling you get when you see a part installed wrong. Fine until the engine turns over. I asked. Have these documents been officially recorded with the county? Her eyes darkened for a fraction of a second. Not long enough for most people to notice, but I did. You can check yourself, she said. Faster now. But if you do not cooperate, we will file a lien. Notify the county about improper land use. Make it very difficult for you to get permits. Lien, county. Difficult. The words were thrown like stones. I thought about her timing. Just days after I bought the land. Not too soon. Not too late. Exactly when I was still measuring, still imagining. Not random. Tactical. I laughed. Not loud. Not long. A sound that escaped because otherwise I would say something I should not. HOA fees on empty land, I repeated. She tilted her head, her voice turning cold. This is not a joke. We have done this before. That sentence hit harder than any threat. We have done this before. Meaning I was not the first. Meaning others had stood here, heard these same words, and maybe paid just to make it go away. I handed the papers back. I need to see officially recorded documents. She snapped the binder shut, the metal clip making a dry sound. You are making this harder than it needs to be, she said. Then she turned and walked away without waiting for my response. Her heels left my soil, leaving small dents behind. I watched her until she disappeared toward the white mansion. The wind moved through the field. The cattle lowered their heads and went back to grazing, as if nothing had happened. But something in me had changed. Not fear. Clarity. I had seen that look before. The look of someone who thinks they have power because others do not know what power they actually have. They looked at me and saw a man in dirty clothes, rough hands, standing alone on empty land. They did not see the nights I spent reading law under a weak light. They did not see the years I learned patience from the most stubborn machines. They did not see that real power does not live in a loud voice or thick paper. That night, lying on a makeshift bed, I thought about my uncle's words. Land will not betray you if you are willing to listen to it. I listened. And the land told me one thing clearly. If I wanted to keep this land, I could not avoid what was coming. I would have to stand up. Slowly. Steadily. And within the law. I had not even said my name yet when the woman behind the counter looked up and told me to take a number. Then she paused, narrowed her eyes at me, and said something that sent a chill straight down my spine. You are here because of the Price property, aren't you? The public records office at the county courthouse was small. The smell of old paper and stale coffee blended into something that only exists in places where time moves slowly. Low ceiling, fluorescent lights humming faintly. I stood there holding my stack of documents, still trying to process what was happening, when she pulled open a drawer, took out a thick file, and set it on the counter. Her name was Lillian Barker, 72 years old. She had worked here for more than 40 years. She spoke neither fast nor slow, her voice steady like someone who had seen every trick life could throw. I asked how she knew. She shrugged. You are the third person this week who has come in asking about land after dealing with Mrs. Price. That sentence landed between us heavier than any threat I had heard so far. The third person. Meaning I was not alone. Meaning what I suspected the night before was not just a gut feeling. Lillian opened the first folder. My deed. She placed her finger on the seal and tapped it lightly. Agricultural land. Classified since the 1960s. No HOA recorded. Clear as day. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. She moved to the second file. The original survey. Boundary lines drawn in ink that had faded yellow. Old handwritten notes. Your land sits outside all residential developments, she said. It was here decades before anything called Cedar Bluff Estates existed. I felt steadier, more grounded. But then Lillian pulled out a third file. Thinner. Newer. The Price HOA records. 14 lots. All clustered around the mansion on the hill. She pointed line by line. Square by square. Your parcel is not included. Not close. Not connected. I thought that would be the end of it. But Lillian did not close the file. She looked up at me. Her eyes sharp and sad at the same time. There is something else, she said. Mrs. Price has been here several times this past month. My chest tightened. How many times? 6, she answered immediately. 6 times. Each time, asking how to amend records, how to add land into an HOA covenant, how to make it look legitimate. The air in the room felt heavier, I asked, and her answer made me grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. She claimed she had the landowner's consent. Lillian bent down, pulled a single sheet of paper from the drawer, and slid it toward me. At the bottom was my name, typed. Beneath it, a crooked signature. Not mine, not anything resembling an adult's handwriting. I stared at it for a long moment. That familiar feeling returned. The same one you get when you see a fake part. Something you can spot at a glance. I said, I never signed this. Lillian nodded. I know. I did not file it. It smelled wrong. Smelled wrong. Crude words, but exact. The smell of a dirty trick, done in a hurry. The smell of someone who thinks printing enough paper can create authority. I asked what would have happened if she had filed it. Lillian looked at me, her voice lowering. Then, you would have had to fight for a very long time to undo it. And some people did not have the strength to do that. In that moment, I thought about the others. The ones who stood here before me. The ones who might have paid just to avoid ever coming back to this room. I thought of Madeline Price, of her confident smile, and I understood something clearly. This was not a random HOA Karen story. This was a system. Lillian stacked the files neatly and slid my deed back to me like she was handing over a weapon. "Your land is clean," she said, "but you have to keep it clean. Do not sign anything. Do not pay anything. And if they come back here, I will remember their faces." I thanked her. When I stepped out of the courthouse, the midday sun was bright enough to make me squint. Everything looked the same. The road, the trees, the cars passing by. But inside me, something had shifted. I was no longer the man standing alone on empty land, shaken by a glossy binder. I knew who I was dealing with, and more importantly, I knew where I stood, on my legally protected land, with the law behind me. As I drove away, a calm and steady thought settled in. If they wanted to play paperwork games, I would play. But I would play it all the way through. And this time, they would not be the ones in control. The letter was shoved under my door the next morning. No envelope, no greeting. The bold line at the top froze me in place for a few seconds. Notice of violation and immediate payment demand. The paper still smelled of fresh ink, that sharp scent of an overworked, cheap printer. I read each line slowly, the way people read medical test results. $22,000 had turned into $25,000 overnight. Late fees, processing fees, administrative fees. A long list of nicely named charges meant to hide an ugly truth. Someone was trying to scare me into submission. I folded the paper, slipped it into my pocket, and stepped outside. It was still early. A thin layer of dew covered the grass. I planted the first no trespassing sign along the eastern boundary, the side where the white mansion had a clear view. The steel post drove into the soil with a sharp, steady clang, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. No rush, no shaking, just doing what needed to be done. Around midday, my phone rang. A woman's voice, unfamiliar and highly professional. "This is Cedar Bluff Property Management. Our records show you have an outstanding balance that must be resolved immediately to avoid collection actions." Property management. I smirked. A new name for the same old game. I asked for the company address. She recited it quickly and smoothly, like she had done it hundreds of times. It sounded like a high-end office building. I opened my browser and typed it in. The result popped up almost instantly. A mail receiving store. A UPS store. A rented mailbox. I said nothing and let her keep talking. Her tone hardened. "If you fail to pay, your account will be forwarded to collections. Your credit will be severely impacted." I interrupted her. "When was your company established?" There was a brief pause. Very brief, but long enough for me to notice. She answered vaguely. "Recently." Then she hung up. The afternoon faded quickly. I sat on the makeshift steps, watching the sun slide behind the hills. The land was quiet, but I knew I was no longer alone. Not long after, the sound of an engine drifted up from the dirt road. A black vehicle rolled slowly along the boundary line. The window lowered. The man in the polo shirt, Brad Price, looked straight at me. No greeting, no smile. He raised his phone and took a photo. One, then another. I lifted my hand and waved. He did not react. The car sat there for a long moment, as if measuring whether I was worth pressing harder. I let him look. I did not hide. I did not approach. Finally, the engine revved, and the car moved on. That night, I called the sheriff's office. The man who showed up the next morning was Deputy Mason Hart. Tall, broad-shouldered, gray eyes. The way he stepped out of the vehicle told me he had been doing this job a long time. I showed him everything. The letter, the calls, the photos, the fake printed emails. He did not look surprised. He just sighed. "The Price family," he said. "We have heard about them." I asked what that meant. He leaned against his cruiser and looked toward the hills. Over the past 2 years, a few people have paid just to keep the peace. Not many, but enough for them to think the scheme works. There was an older man south of the county, paid nearly $8,000 before his son found out. My stomach tightened. Not from fear, from anger. Anger for people who did not have the strength to fight back. Anger that wrongdoing survives not because it is strong, but because too many people are exhausted. Deputy Hart studied me more closely now. "You are not like the others," he said. "You did not pay right away. You went to the courthouse. That makes them angry." I gave a dry smile. "I just want to farm," he nodded. "But when you stand on land with value, someone will want to take it without buying it." He pulled an old business card from his pocket. "If they keep harassing you, call me. And if you want to take this further, I can connect you with a lawyer who specializes in agricultural land rights." I took the card. The paper was worn. The ink faded. But it carried more weight than any binder Madeline Price had ever held. That night, I sat alone, rereading every line of law, every note I had taken at the courthouse. Outside, the wind moved across the empty field, carrying the smell of damp soil. I thought about the people who had paid, about Madeline and Brad, about their confidence, about the way they looked at me, like a number on a list. They thought I was beneath them because my hands were dirty. They did not know I had spent my entire life fixing the most broken machines, patiently removing bolt after bolt until the truth revealed itself. And I understood one thing very clearly. If they had climbed too high on fake ladders, then sooner or later, all it would take was the right touch in the right place for everything to collapse. I did not need to rush. I only needed to stand firm. I woke up to find my name posted on the community board like a warning. Not a wooden board by the road, but a digital one, where every glance lands before anyone has time to sort truth from fiction. The post went up early in the morning. A long message, written in a tone of manufactured concern, signed by Madeline Price. Residents of Cedar Bluff should be alerted to a suspicious individual who recently moved into the area. This person ignores community standards, refuses to cooperate with the HOA, and has displayed threatening behavior. I read every line, feeling like someone was turning my face inside out in front of a crowd. Less than an hour later, my phone started buzzing nonstop. Unknown numbers. Voices claiming to be neighbors, attorneys, even a local reporter. "Do you have a response to allegations that you pose a danger to the community? We have received a formal complaint regarding your aggressive conduct." Each call was like a needle, not painful at first, but constant. I stepped outside to breathe. The sky was heavy with clouds. The wind was stronger than it had been in days. As I was setting more boundary stakes along the northern edge, I heard a familiar engine. The black vehicle appeared again. This time not alone. 2 cars, then 3. They pulled up right along the boundary. They stepped out like a rehearsed unit. 3 couples, middle-aged, neatly dressed. Each person holding a notebook, some with cameras. One woman approached, her smile tight and strained. "We are the Neighborhood Safety Committee. We are here to document unsafe conditions." Unsafe. I looked around. A tractor parked properly, a fuel tank locked, and clearly labeled. Empty land. Quiet. I asked where exactly the danger was. She glanced past me, then wrote something in her notebook. Improper storage of agricultural equipment. Environmental risk. Prior threatening behavior toward residents. I understood immediately. This list had been written before they arrived. They were not here to observe. They were here to create a record. I took out my phone and started recording. The atmosphere shifted instantly. One man frowned. "You are not allowed to film us." I spoke slowly. "You are standing on my property. You are taking photos of me. I am simply documenting what is happening." They stepped back a few feet, but did not leave. Cameras kept clicking. Eyes kept probing. 20 minutes. 30 minutes. They stood there, staging a silent performance where I played the role of the dangerous man. When they finally left, I watched until their cars disappeared. I was no longer angry, just coldly alert. They were doing one thing very deliberately. They were trying to turn me into the problem. That evening, I met Deputy Hart at the small diner in town. The coffee there was weak and bitter, but he drank it like someone who had done so for years. I told him everything. The post, the calls, the group taking photos. He was not surprised. "This is the next step," he said. "When money does not scare you, they attack your reputation. Once you are labeled dangerous, everything they do looks justified." I asked if they had the right to do this. He studied me a moment longer. "They can try, but if they coordinate false claims and sign off together, that becomes something else." He gave me a name: Tessa Langford, an agricultural land rights attorney. She has handled cases like this for 20 years. Does not like noise, but very good at endings. I called her the next morning. Her voice was low and steady. I explained everything. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she said something that eased the tightness in my chest. "They are trying to reverse the roles, make you look like the aggressor to hide what they are doing. But they are leaving too many footprints." That afternoon, I decided to do something different. I invited neighbors who were not part of Cedar Bluff onto my land. No meeting, no speeches, just a simple barbecue. An old grill, a few folding chairs, cold beer. They came. One person. Then two. Then more. Stories began to flow like water. One had paid road fees, while the road stayed broken. Another had handed over money for a gate that never existed. An elderly woman spoke with a trembling voice, saying she had paid nearly $8,000 just to be left alone. I looked at their faces in the flickering firelight. I saw exhaustion, shame, and relief. Not because they had been deceived, but because they were finally saying it out loud. In that moment, I understood that Madeline Price was not just targeting me. She was targeting silence. And once that silence began to crack, the fake authority she relied on started to wobble. Night fell and people went home. I stood alone on the land, listening to the wind move through the newly planted boundary stakes. I was no longer the underestimated man facing a binder. I was standing in the middle of a growing web of truth, and I knew that from now on, every step they took would be seen. The bank statements arrived on a rainy morning, thick enough to bend the envelope. I had not opened it yet, but I already knew. There was something in the weight of it that said the game had shifted. Tessa Langford sat across from me in her small office, a room filled with the smell of old wood and paperwork that had passed through hundreds of cases. She did not smile when she turned the first page. She did not raise an eyebrow. She just flipped, read, then nodded slightly, like a mechanic spotting a familiar crack in metal. $47,000, she said. Collected over 2 years. No service contracts. No maintenance expenses. No legitimate invoices. All of it went straight into the Price family's personal accounts. I stayed silent. The number echoed in my head not as money, but as the count of times someone had been forced to pay just to be left alone. I thought of the elderly woman whose voice trembled at the barbecue. I thought of the man who said he only wanted the road fixed so his hay truck would not break an axle. Tessa looked at me. "This is not management. This is extraction." She opened another folder. Background records. Brad Price. Madeline Price. 2 names that looked clean on the surface, but behind them were traces left behind. A rushed exit from Texas. Fraud complaints that never quite reached court. Unpaid contractor debts. They did not move because they loved nature. They moved because someone started asking questions. I asked if this was the first time they had done this here. Tessa shook her head. "No. This is the first time they met someone who refused to stay quiet." She slid a thin stack of papers toward me. Complaints from other counties. The same pattern. Agricultural land near development. Self-appointed HOAs. Vague fees. Lien threats. Public shaming. Those who paid were left alone. Those who did not were crushed. A cold feeling ran along my spine. This was no longer a local HOA Karen story. This was a chain of Karen stories, repeated with intent. I was not the target. I was just the next link. Tessa leaned back in her chair, fingers interlaced. They think you are just a man, standing alone on empty land. But they do not know you have been gathering evidence the right way. They are leaving footprints everywhere. That afternoon, I returned to the land. The rain had stopped. The soil was dark, heavy with water. I set a few more boundary posts, not to provoke, but to assert. While I worked, I got a message from Deputy Hart. We need to talk. We met in the parking lot behind an old gas station, a place few people passed by. He stood there, holding his hat, his expression heavier than usual. I showed him what Tessa had uncovered. He read slowly. Very slowly. Then he exhaled. I figured it was not just you. He spoke quietly, as if the wind itself might be listening. Similar cases are being linked at a higher level. Federal fraud. Mail and wire fraud. But they need one case that is clear. Clean. With people willing to stand up, I asked. And he looked straight at me. You are standing in the right place. That night, I lit the grill again. This time, not to prove I was harmless, but to listen. The neighbors came, less hesitant than before. One story led to another. Someone talked about being called over and over until they finally paid. Another described threatening letters arriving while their family was in mourning. I looked around the circle of firelight. I saw shame in their eyes. But I also saw something else beginning to form. Anger. Not loud. Not reckless. A kind of anger that had ripened. When everyone left, Tessa called me. Her voice was serious. I contacted someone. A federal agent. She specializes in agricultural land fraud. She has reviewed your file, and she is very interested. I ended the call and stood alone on the land. The night wind moved through the boundary posts. I thought back to the moment Madeline Price first looked at me. The single second she chose to underestimate me. I understood then that everything had been decided in that moment. They chose the wrong person to look down on. And now, this story no longer belonged only to me. It was becoming something larger. Slowly, but irreversibly, I discovered the signature of a dead man on an afternoon when no one was prepared for that kind of truth. And when the truth surfaced, it did not knock. It kicked everything open. Tessa called me back to the county courthouse, but not to the public records counter. This time, we went down to the basement. The old wooden stairs creaked under our feet, the smell of dampness and decaying paper rising with every step. Weak yellow lights cast shadows over rows of metal shelves stacked with record boxes. Lillian Barker was already there, thin gloves on her hands, her face more serious than I had ever seen it. She spoke quietly, as if the walls themselves could listen. Mrs. Price asked a lot of questions about agricultural land protection records from the 1960s. Too many questions for someone with no legal interest in them. Tessa looked at me. Her expression was no longer that of a lawyer collecting evidence. It was the look of someone about to open a door that could never be closed again. Lillian pulled out a heavy box and set it on the wooden table. The handwritten label had faded. Agricultural zoning, 1960s to 70s. When she lifted the lid, dust rose like smoke. Inside were thick stacks of paper, bound with rusted staples. Tessa turned the pages slowly, carefully. Then she stopped. "Here it is," she said. "Permanent agricultural protection." I leaned closer. The old seal. The handwritten notes of a clerk from decades ago. The wording was clear. This parcel could never be placed into any residential agreement in the future. No HOA, no housing development, no exceptions. My knees felt weak. Every threat Madeline Price had made, every binder she had waved, every promise of authority she claimed, All of it collapsed in the face of a document older than her mansion. But Tessa was not finished. She turned to Lillian. And this? Lillian nodded and pulled out a thinner file from the lowest drawer. Electronic records. 3 days before the tax auction when I bought the land, a deed amendment request had been submitted. My heart pounded so hard, my ears rang. Amended how? I asked. To add your parcel to the Cedar Bluff Estates HOA covenant, Lillian replied. With the landowner's signature. Tessa placed the document in front of me. I looked down. The previous owner's name was typed. And the signature beneath it looked familiar. Not familiar because I had seen it before, but familiar because it resembled the forged signature on the consent form Madeline had shown me earlier. A chill ran up my spine. I whispered, "This man is dead." Tessa did not ask. She already knew. She opened her phone and typed quickly. The death record appeared. The previous owner had passed away 6 months before the date this signature was created. No one spoke for several seconds. The basement felt frozen in place. Then Lillian continued, her voice trembling slightly. That request was submitted online. The system logged the network address. She slid a small slip of paper toward Tessa. The IP address. Tessa looked at it, then raised her eyes to me. It matches the internet connection at the Price residence. Everything collapsed at once. Not with an explosion, but with the heavy silence of a con fully exposed. They had not just demanded money. They had not just forged documents. They had tried to steal my land before I ever set foot on it. Tessa let out a long breath, like someone who had just solved a dangerous equation. This is premeditation. Electronic fraud, she said. Federal authorities will be very interested. I rested my hands on the table. In my mind, I saw Madeline Price, standing on my land, confident, certain, as if everything already belonged to her. I understood then that her confidence did not come from real power. It came from the belief that no one would have the patience to dig down to this basement. Tessa placed her hand on the file and spoke softly. We do not need to confront them directly. We just need to let them keep doing what they always do, with eyes watching. When we left the courthouse, the late afternoon sun hit my face, bright and real. I took a deep breath. The air outside was nothing like the damp basement below. Lighter, clearer. I was no longer a man forced into defense. I was holding something they could not buy, could not forge, and could not threaten their way into taking. The truth, and I knew that from the moment the dead man's signature was exposed, every step Madeline Price and Brad Price took from then on was happening on ground that was already giving way beneath them. The smell of diesel fuel hit my nose at 3 a.m, strong enough to wake an entire field. In the darkness, I knew immediately the trap had been triggered. Tessa told me we had to let them believe they were winning, believe I was scared, believe I needed money, and believe that one more push would make me fold. The plan was laid out clean and cold, like setting a steel trap and covering it with grass. A rumor about a state-level agricultural inspection, along with a $40,000 support grant for new farmers, was released in exactly the right place, to the right people, at the right time. I did not need to lie much. I only needed to say just enough and let greed do the rest. The days that followed were unnervingly quiet. No threatening letters. No rapid-fire phone calls. That silence made me more alert than noise ever could. I knew they were calculating. And then, just as Tessa predicted, the call came late one afternoon. Madeline Price's voice was different. No sharp edge. No arrogance. Softer. Urgent. We need to resolve this before any inspections take place, she said. If you pay $15,000 in cash, we will clear all violations. I let a pause hang. I said I would consider it. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, fast and shallow. That was the scent of desperation. That night, they crossed a line they could never step back from. I woke to the stench of chemicals. Under my flashlight, I saw the test plots soaked in a dark liquid. The young plants were collapsed, their leaves curled like they had been burned. The damage was not just financial. It was a naked insult. But I did not shout. I did not call anyone right away. I simply stepped back and looked straight into the infrared camera recording everything. The next morning, Tessa watched the footage in silence. She did not ask if I was angry. She said only one word, good. They just put their names on a heavier list. The fake calls started again. This time, it was a man claiming to be an environmental investigator. Then someone posing as an attorney. Then another pretending to be a journalist. I asked for badge numbers. They hung up. Each call was another brick added to the wall of evidence. Inspection day arrived faster than I expected. Early that morning, 3 rental cars parked along the boundary like a silent invasion. 6 people stepped out, clipboards and cameras in hand, replaying the familiar roles of authority figures. My cameras started recording from every angle. Not a single step was missed. At exactly 9 o'clock, the truck carrying the fake agricultural inspector arrived. He stepped out, gray-haired, moving with the slow confidence of someone more used to paperwork than soil. Less than 5 minutes later, Madeline and Brad Price appeared, walking fast and decisively, like they had been waiting all week for this moment. "You are not authorized to conduct any inspection," Madeline shouted, lifting her binder like a shield. "This property falls under HOA authority." The inspector replied calmly, "I am carrying out official state business." Brad stepped forward, blocking his path, close enough that I could smell expensive cologne mixed with sweat. Not without our permission. In that moment, I knew everything was over. When Madeline pulled the inspector aside, lowering her voice, the cameras still captured every word. "We can make this beneficial for both of us. $8,000. Just note a few minor violations." Brad did not wait. He produced a thick envelope. 10,000. Walk away. Say it failed. The inspector looked up, his voice clear and firm. "You are asking me to falsify a state report." Madeline froze. Then she panicked. She pulled out more documents, papers stamped and signed with forgeries, waving them like a final lifeline. "These are official reports. You have no authority." The inspector scanned one line, then looked straight at her. "The person who signed this died 2 years ago." The air shattered. The 2 men with Brad stepped back immediately, mumbling apologies, saying they were only hired to take measurements. Madeline began talking fast, her voice breaking, threatening lawsuits, retaliation, things only someone collapsing dares to say. Then engines sounded in the distance. Sheriff vehicles. Federal vehicles. No sirens. No rush. Just the steady arrival of authority that does not need to shout. When I stepped out from the shadow of the barn, Madeline saw me and understood. All her earlier contempt returned in her eyes and transformed into pure fear. The game had ended before she ever realized who she was playing against. I stood still, dirt on my hands, watching the handcuffs close. The wind moved across the field. The ruined seedlings lay motionless. But I knew they would be replanted. Some things can be destroyed in a single night, and some things, once exposed to the light, can never be buried again. The metallic click of the handcuffs closing was quiet, but it ended everything. No shouting was needed. No explanations. It was over. In that instant, Madeline Price stood frozen as the agent read her rights. The face that had once been perfectly made up drained of color, as if the makeup no longer had anything to cling to. Brad reacted differently. He turned and ran, the raw instinct of someone used to escaping, but the ground was softer than he expected. After only a few steps, he slipped and went face down into the mud. Deputy Hart did not rush. He walked up, placed a hand on Brad's back, and held him there. The contrast was clear. One man accustomed to real work. One man accustomed to smooth words. The outcome needed no further explanation. Neighbors had gathered along the boundary line without me noticing. No one cheered. No one laughed. There were only slow, heavy nods. as if each person was finally exhaling a breath they had been holding for far too long. An elderly woman raised a hand to cover her mouth. A man stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the scene. Justice, even when it arrives late, still leaves people quiet. The federal vehicles left my land as the sun climbed higher. Dust settled. The wind moved again through the damaged plots. I stood alone in the field, dried mud on my hands, feeling strangely empty. No triumph, no victory, just a sense of quiet, returning to where it belonged. A few hours later, Lillian Barker arrived with a fresh stack of papers. She handed me the updated record. Permanent agricultural protection reaffirmed. No HOA could ever touch this land again. She looked at me and gave a small smile. "I told you before," she said. "Keep the land clean." Now it truly is. The news spread quickly. Reporters arrived and asked questions. I kept my answers short. Not because I had nothing to say, but because this story had never been about me. When they asked if I had a message, I gave them one sentence. Land does not protect itself. The people who hold it must do that. The months that followed moved slowly. The court proceedings took place. Sentences were handed down. 4 years in federal prison for Madeline, 5 years for Brad, for attempting to flee, and for bribery. Assets were seized. Families were repaid every dollar, with interest. I watched the checks being handed back and saw not just relief on their faces, but trust being restored. The recovered money did not disappear. We chose to use it for what had been promised and never delivered. A real community improvement fund, shared equipment purchases, repairs to the dirt road, small things, done properly. No signs, no binders, just work. My field began to heal. I replanted the young crops that had been destroyed. They grew slowly, but strong. Each morning, I walked the boundary line, listening to birds, to the wind, to my own breathing blending with the land. No more clicking heels, no more hastily printed papers, just real silence. One day, a real estate developer called and offered to buy the land for a very high price. Fast, clean, cash. I looked out across the field and said no. Some things are not for sale, not because the price is too low, but because their value is not measured in money. I do not think I did anything extraordinary. I simply refused to bow. And maybe that is why this story is worth telling. Not to boast, but to remind. If you are facing an HOA or a self-appointed Karen claiming authority, if you are being pressured with paperwork and threats, stop. Breathe. Verify. Ask the right offices. Stay calm. The truth is usually more patient than the loudest voice. If you have experienced something similar, share your story in the comments. Someone reading may need to know they are not alone. If you believe this story deserves to be shared, please like and subscribe so you do not miss the next ones. Here, we do not celebrate noise. We stand on the side of fairness. And sometimes, fairness begins with one person choosing to stand their ground on their own land.